The moment your past finally sees what it threw away is rarely the moment you expect. Daniel Parker found that out on a quiet Thursday evening. The television was playing in the background of his living room while he sorted through emails on his tablet. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the suburban home he had fought so hard to keep. The house was spotless. The kitchen counters gleamed beneath warm lights. Everything looked exactly the way he wanted it to look. Controlled. Predictable. Successful. Then a familiar face appeared on the screen. His hand froze. The tablet slipped slightly in his grip. For a second, he thought he was imagining it. But there she was. Emily Parker, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years. The woman who had walked out of the courthouse with nothing except $300 and a broken smile. The television host stood beside her, laughing as customers lined up around an enormous food truck, painted cream and blue. Above the footage, bold letters stretched across the screen. America's fastest-growing food truck story. Daniel sat forward. His pulse quickened. He turned up the volume. The camera followed Emily as she handed a customer a basket of hot honey chicken sliders. Steam rose into the cool autumn air. People cheered when they recognized her. Someone asked for a photo. Someone else thanked her for inspiring them. Emily smiled. Not the tired smile he remembered. Not the smile of a woman struggling to survive. This was different. This was confidence. This was peace. The interviewer spoke excitedly about how her company had expanded into multiple cities, how her story had captured millions of hearts across the country, how she had started everything with only $300 after losing nearly everything she owned. Daniel's stomach tightened. He remembered that day clearly. He remembered watching Emily leave. No house, no car, no custody, no future, as far as he could see. He remembered believing that chapter of her life was over. But now millions of people were hearing her name. Millions were celebrating her success. Then the camera zoomed closer. Emily looked directly toward the interviewer and laughed softly before saying something that made Daniel stop breathing for a moment. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you're actually capable of becoming. The audience applauded. Daniel stared at the screen. He didn't notice the coffee growing cold beside him. He didn't notice the rain anymore. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the woman he left behind. He was looking at someone he no longer understood. And what he didn't know was that this television interview was only the beginning. 3 years earlier, the sky above Franklin County looked the color of wet concrete when Emily Parker walked down the courthouse steps, carrying everything she still owned in 2 canvas bags. The hearing had lasted less than 2 hours. Less than 2 hours to dismantle a life she had spent 12 years building. The cold wind pushed strands of blonde hair across her face as people hurried past without noticing her. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if she was all right. Across the parking lot, Daniel loaded the children into the family SUV. Sophie was 11. Ethan had just turned 8. Emily watched them through tears she refused to let fall. She lifted her hand to wave. Ethan waved back. Sophie did too, but only after looking toward her father first. The gesture lasted barely a second before the vehicle pulled away and disappeared into afternoon traffic. The silence afterward felt heavier than the judgment itself. Emily stood there for almost a minute staring at the empty road. Then she checked her bank account. $307. That was all she had left. No house, no vehicle, no savings worth mentioning. The apartment she had planned to rent was already gone because another applicant had offered 6 months of rent up front. Her phone battery sat at 12%. The temperature was dropping. Every practical problem seemed to arrive at once. She found a bench outside a small coffee shop and sat down. The smell of roasted coffee drifted through the air every time the door opened. People laughed inside. Students worked on laptops. Business meetings continued as if the world had not changed. Emily stared at her reflection in the dark window glass. 36 years old. No clear plan. No certainty. No idea how she would rebuild. Her stomach growled. She realized she had not eaten since sunrise. $3.80 bought her a cup of coffee and a plain bagel. She stretched the meal over nearly an hour because she was already calculating how many days $300 might last. By sunset, she found herself standing outside a small church shelter on the edge of town. The building smelled faintly of old wood and floor polish. A volunteer named Margaret handed her a folded blanket and pointed toward a narrow room in the back. Emily thanked her quietly. That night she lay awake, staring at water stains on the ceiling. Every few minutes, she looked at photos of Sophie and Ethan on her phone. Then she made herself a promise. She would not spend the rest of her life explaining what she lost. Somehow, someday, she would build something nobody could take away. The next morning, Emily woke before sunrise, to the sound of rain tapping softly against the shelter window. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then reality returned. The narrow cot beneath her, the folded blanket, the empty space beside her where her children should have been. She sat up slowly and checked her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. The screen showed a photo of Sophie and Ethan smiling on a beach from years earlier. Emily stared at it longer than she intended. Then she got dressed and stepped into the cold morning air. The church served coffee in white foam cups and oatmeal in small paper bowls. Emily thanked the volunteers and sat alone at a folding table near the wall. Around her were people carrying struggles of their own. Some were looking for work. Some were rebuilding after loss. Nobody asked questions. They simply nodded politely and continued their mornings. Emily spent the next several days searching for jobs. She filled out applications at diners, grocery stores, retail stores, and warehouses. She walked miles every day because she could not afford transportation. By the end of the week, her shoes were beginning to wear thin around the heels. Rejections arrived quietly. Some employers never called. Others smiled politely and promised to keep her resume on file. One manager told her she was overqualified. Another said she lacked recent experience. Every answer felt like a different version of the same word. No. Yet the hardest part was not the job search. It was the supervised visits with Sophie and Ethan every Saturday afternoon. They met at a family center 20 minutes outside town. The room smelled faintly of crayons and cleaning supplies. Bright posters covered the walls. Emily brought homemade cookies the first week. Sophie hugged her immediately. Ethan refused to let go of her hand for almost 10 minutes. When the visit ended, both children asked when they could come home. Emily forced herself to smile. She promised she was working on it. After they left, she sat in her carless silence and cried for the first time since the courthouse. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the pressure inside her chest to escape. Days later, she found herself walking through an industrial part of town where old warehouses sat beside railroad tracks. Rusted metal fences lined the streets. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement. That was where she noticed it. An old food trailer parked behind a repair garage. The paint was peeling. One tire looked flat. The serving window hung slightly crooked. Most people would have seen junk. Emily stopped walking. Something about it held her attention. Maybe it was because her mother had owned a small roadside food stand years ago. Maybe it was because she had run out of other ideas. Whatever the reason, she stood there longer than necessary. And for the first time in months, a different possibility entered her mind. The repair garage smelled of motor oil, rust, and old rainwater when Emily returned the following morning. The trailer was still there, sitting behind a chain-link fence, as if it had been forgotten by everyone except time itself. Up close, it looked even worse. The white paint had faded to a dull gray. One side carried deep scratches. The serving window squeaked when the wind moved it. Yet Emily could not stop looking at it. She walked around it slowly, imagining something different. Fresh paint, bright signs, customers standing in line. The image felt impossible, but it also felt strangely clear. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Most people just see a pile of problems. Emily turned and saw an older man stepping out from the garage. He appeared to be in his late 60s. His work shirt was stained with grease. His silver hair stuck out beneath a worn baseball cap. "I am Walter Hayes," he said. "That trailer belongs to me." Emily introduced herself and asked how much he wanted for it. Walter laughed softly. "You were the first person to ask in 6 months." He explained that he had purchased the trailer years earlier, with plans to start a barbecue business after retirement. Then, health issues and life delays got in the way. The dream never happened. The trailer remained parked behind the garage ever since. Emily listened carefully. She told him about her mother's roadside food stand. She described summers spent helping prepare recipes before sunrise. She talked about homemade honey chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea. For the first time in months, her voice carried excitement instead of exhaustion. Walter noticed immediately. He studied her face for several seconds before nodding slowly. "How much money do you have?" he asked. Emily hesitated. The answer embarrassed her. $300. Walter looked back at the trailer, then at Emily, then back at the trailer again. "The trailer is worth more than that," he said. Emily's shoulders dropped. She had expected that answer. She thanked him for his time and started to walk away. "But dreams are usually worth less if nobody uses them," Walter called out. Emily stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. $300. That is the price. She stared at him in disbelief. "Why?" Walter smiled. "Because I think you need it more than I do." Emily's hands trembled as she accepted the keys. The metal felt cold against her skin. Before she left, Walter pointed toward the trailer one last time. "Do not build a food truck," he said. "Build a reason for people to stop." Emily drove away with tears in her eyes and a trailer behind her. For the first time since losing everything, she was not driving toward survival. She was driving toward possibility. The next 6 weeks tested every promise Emily had made to herself. Every morning began before dawn. The church shelter kitchen became her preparation room. The smell of coffee mixed with honey, spices, and fresh bread as she measured ingredients beneath fluorescent lights while most of the town still slept. She spent her days sanding metal, painting panels, repairing shelves, and learning things she had never expected to learn. Walter stopped by often. Sometimes he brought tools, sometimes advice, sometimes nothing more than a quiet nod that reminded her she was not completely alone. By the end of the month, the trailer no longer looked abandoned. Bright cream paint covered the exterior. Blue lettering stretched across the serving window. Mama Grace Kitchen, named after her mother. Named after the woman who taught her that food was not just something people ate. It was something that made people feel remembered. The grand opening attracted exactly 4 customers. 1 bought a sweet tea. 1 purchased cornbread. 2 looked at the menu and left. Emily smiled through every disappointment. She thanked every customer. She cleaned every surface twice. She stayed open until sunset, even when nobody came. The second week was not much better. Some days she earned less than $20. Some nights, she lay awake, calculating expenses, and wondering how much longer she could keep going. Then, one Saturday afternoon, a black SUV slowed beside the truck. Emily looked up and immediately recognized the driver. Daniel stepped out wearing pressed khakis and a navy polo shirt. Sophie and Ethan climbed out behind him. Emily's heart nearly stopped. Seeing her children unexpectedly felt like sunshine after a storm. Sophie ran forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. Ethan followed a second later. For a few beautiful moments, nothing else existed. Then Daniel looked around at the nearly empty parking lot. His eyes moved across the truck, the folding tables, and the handwritten menu board. "So this is what you have been working on," he said. His voice sounded calm, but Emily recognized the judgment underneath it. "It is a start," she replied. Daniel gave a short smile. "I hope it works out. The children need stability." The words landed harder than he probably realized. Before Emily could answer, a customer walked away after glancing at the menu. Daniel noticed. So did Emily. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then he gathered the children and prepared to leave. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Emily stood alone beside her truck, watching the dust settle. The parking lot was empty again. The register held less than $40. But she refused to quit. What she did not know was that someone had been watching the entire exchange from across the street. The woman watching from across the street was named Rachel Moore. She was a local television producer who spent most of her days searching for stories that people usually ignored. At first, she had only stopped because the food truck looked interesting. Then she noticed the children. Then the man who seemed determined to evaluate everything around him. Then the expression on Emily's face after they drove away. Rachel stayed in her car for another 10 minutes. She watched Emily wipe down empty tables that did not need cleaning. She watched her rearrange condiment bottles that were already perfectly aligned. She recognized the behavior immediately. It was the look of someone trying to stay busy because standing still would force them to feel everything at once. The next afternoon, Rachel returned and ordered lunch. Emily served her honey chicken sliders and sweet tea. The food arrived in a simple paper basket. Steam rose into the cool autumn air. Rachel took one bite and immediately understood something important. The food was not just good, it was memorable. The honey glaze balanced perfectly with the seasoning. The bread was warm. Every ingredient tasted intentional. Rachel ordered a second basket before finishing the first. Over the next week, she returned 4 more times. Each visit revealed another piece of Emily's story. The church shelter, the custody arrangement, the old trailer, the $300, the long nights. Emily never complained. She never blamed anyone. She simply described what happened and what she hoped to build next. That detail stayed with Rachel more than anything else. Most people talked about what they lost. Emily talked about what she was creating. On Friday evening, Rachel sat inside the television station, reviewing footage for another assignment, when an idea refused to leave her alone. She opened a new file on her computer and typed a title across the top of the screen. Local Mother Rebuilds Her Life. One meal at a time. The following Monday, she returned with a camera crew. Emily almost said no. She did not trust attention. She did not trust promises. But Rachel convinced her that people needed stories that reminded them resilience still existed. The interview lasted less than an hour. Emily answered every question honestly. She talked about her mother. She talked about Sophie and Ethan. She talked about the food truck. What she did not realize was that Rachel had already made another decision. She was not planning a small local segment anymore. She believed this story deserved something much bigger. And the first call she made after leaving the parking lot would quietly change everything. The segment aired on a Wednesday evening at 6:42 p.m. Emily almost missed it because she was cleaning the grill after a slow lunch rush. Walter called first, then Margaret from the church shelter, then 3 customers in less than 10 minutes. By the time Emily found the broadcast online, the video had already been shared hundreds of times. She watched herself on the screen standing beside Mama Grace's kitchen, while soft music played beneath Rachel's narration. The story was simple. A mother starting over. A forgotten trailer. $300. Long days. Determination. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing invented. just the truth. Yet something unexpected happened. People connected with it. The next morning, Emily arrived at the parking lot before sunrise and immediately knew something was different. Cars were already waiting. A line stretched from the service window before she had even unlocked the truck. Construction workers, teachers, nurses, retirees, families with children. Some came for breakfast. Some came because they saw the story. Others came because someone they trusted told them the food was worth trying. By noon, she had sold more meals than she normally sold in an entire week. The smell of honey chicken filled the air. The register kept ringing. Customers took photos beside the truck. Local business owners introduced themselves. One restaurant supplier offered discounted ingredients. Another customer volunteered to help manage social media pages. For the first time, opportunity arrived faster than Emily could process it. That Saturday, she saw Sophie and Ethan again during their scheduled visit. Both children ran toward her, carrying printed copies of the television article. Sophie could barely contain her excitement. Ethan proudly told everyone in the room that his mother was famous. Emily laughed harder than she had in years. For a moment, everything felt possible. But not everyone reacted the same way. Across town, Daniel sat at his kitchen table scrolling through article after article featuring Emily's story. Every search brought new headlines. Every headline brought new attention. Friends began mentioning her name. Co-workers asked questions. Even people who barely knew the details suddenly seemed interested in her success. Daniel told himself it would fade. Internet stories always faded, yet the numbers continued growing. Views became thousands. Thousands became hundreds of thousands. And while Emily focused on serving customers, Rachel was quietly making additional calls. Larger networks had noticed the story. National producers were requesting interviews. One invitation in particular arrived late Friday afternoon. When Rachel read the email, she smiled, because she knew the next chapter was about to become much bigger than anyone imagined. Rachel called Emily on Monday morning while she was unloading supplies from the truck. The excitement in her voice was impossible to miss. A national morning television program wanted to feature her story. Not a local interview, not a regional segment, national television. For several seconds, Emily simply stood there, holding a box of paper containers, while traffic passed behind her. She thought Rachel must be joking. Opportunities like that happen to other people. They didn't happen to mothers sleeping in church shelters and rebuilding their lives one meal at a time. Yet 3 weeks later, she found herself sitting beneath studio lights in New York City. The makeup artist adjusted a loose strand of hair, while producers hurried through final preparations. Everything moved faster than she expected. The cameras, the lights, the countdown clock. Emily felt nervous until the host smiled and asked the first question. Then she simply told the truth. She spoke about losing certainty. She spoke about her children. She spoke about Walter and the old trailer. She spoke about resilience. Millions of viewers watched that morning. Back in Franklin County, customers gathered around televisions inside diners and break rooms. At the church shelter, volunteers cheered when Emily appeared on screen. Walter watched from the repair garage office with tears quietly forming in his eyes. Across town, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table before work. He had intended to watch only a few minutes. Instead, he remained through the entire interview. The audience applauded repeatedly. The host called Emily an example of perseverance. Business experts praised her growth. Then a photograph appeared on the screen showing the original trailer beside a photograph of the thriving food truck operation it had become. Daniel stared silently. What unsettled him most was not the success itself. It was the way people spoke about her. They saw strength. They saw courage. They saw leadership. They saw someone worth admiring. Later that evening, Sophie and Ethan rushed into the living room carrying excitement that could barely fit inside them. Sophie held up her phone. Mom was on national television, she said. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Everybody at school is talking about it. Daniel forced a smile. Then Sophie asked a question that caught him completely off guard. Dad, why did nobody ever tell us Mom was building all of this? The room became very quiet. Daniel searched for an answer that sounded convincing. None came easily. Because for the first time, the story people were hearing about Emily was no longer controlled by assumptions, paperwork, or old decisions. It belonged to her. And what neither Daniel nor Emily knew was that someone watching that interview from a corporate office hundreds of miles away had already decided to reach out with an offer that could change everything once again. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while Emily was reviewing inventory numbers inside the truck. At first, she assumed it was another supplier. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a senior executive from a national retail company that specialized in supporting emerging food brands. They had seen the interview. They had studied her business. They wanted to meet. 2 weeks later, Emily walked into a glass conference room overlooking downtown Nashville. She wore the same navy blazer she had purchased from a thrift store years earlier, carefully pressed and spotless. The executives asked questions for nearly 3 hours. They wanted to know how she built customer loyalty. They wanted to know why people connected so strongly with her story. They wanted to know how many locations she believed she could operate within 5 years. Emily answered honestly. She talked about food. She talked about consistency. She talked about treating every customer like family. Most importantly, she talked about resilience. When the meeting ended, she expected nothing. She had learned long ago not to build her future on promises. 3 days later, the offer arrived. The company wanted to invest in expanding Mama Grace Kitchen across multiple states. The numbers were larger than anything Emily had imagined. Large enough to hire employees. Large enough to open permanent locations. Large enough to create real long-term security. Emily sat in silence after reading the proposal. Then she called Walter. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. They simply laughed. Back in Franklin County, the news spread quickly. Local newspapers covered the story. Business journals featured her company. Community leaders invited her to speak at events. Yet the moment that mattered most arrived on a quiet Saturday morning. Sophie and Ethan were visiting the food truck when a customer recognized Emily and congratulated her on the expansion. The customer turned toward the children and said, "Your mother is building something incredible." Sophie smiled proudly. Ethan did too. Daniel stood nearby listening. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then Ethan looked up at his father and spoke with the simple honesty only children possess. "Mom never gave up, did she?" Daniel stared at the growing line of customers stretching across the parking lot. He looked at the truck. He looked at the employees. He looked at the woman he once believed had no future. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. She did not. Months later, when the second location opened and the first franchise agreement was signed, Emily stood beside Sophie and Ethan beneath a bright blue sky. The old trailer that started everything remained parked nearby, carefully restored and preserved. She placed a hand on its weathered metal side and smiled. $300 had never been the real beginning. The real beginning was the moment she decided her worst day would not become the rest of her life.